Let me before I tell you a couple stories about how I think this looks, let me show you something in our lab that I think will help. Because when we hear about submission to God, satisfaction in God, sometimes we wonder, how does this work? And, what are some things I can do? I pictured this week, this circle is God's presence. So I'm going to write on here, God's presence. We'll just use that symbol there. Everybody see this okay? Great. And there's two things we're after as we linger in God's presence, as we enjoy revival, as we sense the refreshing move of God at His sovereign discretion. I think there's two things we want to keep in mind. There is a submission to God, and then there is a satisfaction in God. These are things I mentioned today. Submission to and satisfaction in. We don't want to be discontented and frustrated with the Lord's authority or His appointed authority. And we really don't want to be envious of the culture around us. We want to be submitted to God and satisfied in God. How does that happen? What are things we can do? Here's some things I've made note of from the text. They're a little more implicit. But I kind of looked at it as three habits in each of these categories. I think three things will help you practice submission. Praying, listening, and thinking. Or you could say reasoning. None of these things happened as the Israelites continued to press their fist into Samuel's face. Samuel prayed, but there's no hint that Israel prayed about this, is there? They weren't listening to Samuel, even though 7 times he said, He will take, He will take, He will take. And they weren't reasoning. They weren't even thinking. Why? Because they were asking for a king who would fight their battles, and they really had not fought any battles. So I think when you find yourself frustrated with authority, God-ordained authority, and you know that really how you respond to that is how you respond to God, here's some ways to practice to kind of get some miles, so to speak, make progress in the idea of learning how to submit. I would pray. Prayer automatically postures you in submission. You know that? In fact, watch this. If you're angry with someone, you'll find it very difficult to pray for them. But start praying for your enemies, and man, submission, humility begins to blanket you. Prayer is a beautiful spiritual discipline that actually begins to breed submission as we take a posture of humility before the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And maybe if you're trying to connect the dots here, you're thinking, well, I really struggle with this. Ask yourself, how often do you actually pray? Is it just when food's involved? Well, maybe that's why you're so proud. Because you never find that secret closet place to say on your knees, God, you rule, you reign. Prayer, listening to others, hearing their perspective. I had a gentleman ask me at 8:30, he said, I'm really struggling with a decision. He said, what are your thoughts? And I knew what I would tell him was not going to set well. I said it kindly. I mean, we were 4 friends. But I was appreciative that he was willing to ask and just listen. That's hard to do, isn't it? My hand's up on that, okay? Yours should be. It's hard sometimes to get outside of input when we think, well, they're not going to tell me what I like to hear, but maybe that's the very way God's going to keep developing submission in you. And by the way, just so you'll know, the people that I listen to and need to hear are church leaders. We believe in plurality here and eldership. I don't run the church. I'm part of one group that acts as one. They have equal authority with me, so we share it. I'm the most visible, yes, but I'm not the boss of the church. So they're important. That input matters. But the Holy Spirit's voice really, to me, a lot of times sounds like my wife's voice. Did you catch that? She's the best person I have to say, hey, am I hearing this right? What are your thoughts about that? And man, it's just amazing how often I'm like, man, the Lord is speaking to me through Julie for sure, So if you got a spouse and they're walking with God, I would definitely realize that's one of the ways that God will work, and you need to listen to that. And then thinking and reasoning, just try to be spiritually logical about things. How do we develop satisfaction in God? I would say 3 words help here. Trust, look, and remember. In fact, let me add to these words here. Trust God's plan. Look, God's perspective. I'll put the word perspective here. And then remember God's character. Okay? And Israel, again, in this story, these weren't things they did. They didn't trust that God did have a plan for a king. They didn't have his perspective, which was longer than theirs. And usually, no doubt, God's is going to be longer than yours. And then they didn't remember his character. So I've just personally found these practices helping me. That when I pray, listen to others, and think and reason, submission is easier to kind of wear. And when I trust the Lord, trust his plan, when I look and have a longer perspective and remember that he is always faithful, he's never going to do harm just because, that helps me then be satisfied. I don't need to go to the culture. I don't need to be like them. God's perfectly able. Those are things that have helped me. Maybe they'll help you.